want to welcome everybody to this evening's session, and we are going to be looking at Persian Bahais in Australia, the revolution. Now, in earlier sessions, we noted that from the 1940s, Persian Bahais had wanted to migrate to Australia. It had not been possible because of the Australian migration policies. But from the 1950s, there was a pool of Iranian Bahais who were able to come on work visas, student visas, and eventually as migrants. By the late 1970s, there may not have been more than 60 or 70 such Persian Bahais in Australia, but the situation changed drastically after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. And due to changes in Australian government policy and a humanitarian assistance program that was beneficial to those Baha'is who were escaping persecution in Iran, I estimate some 5,000 of those Baha'is ended up living in Australia. Now, it's not possible for us to hear so many stories of 5,000 Baha'is, but we can listen to a number of stories, and we start tonight. It's really a very special occasion. We can take the time to hear from a few of these friends and to hear the various stories. So we have Bahereh Sabet to speak to us. We have Kourosh Farrokzadeh, and we have Niloofar Shaibani. I'll introduce Bahereh just briefly. She grew up in Iran, of course. She now lives in the Brisbane community. She's a retired teacher. She lived in Iran until 1980 when she moved to Australia. She has spent some time pioneering in China. She's the mother of two, grandmother of grandchildren, and we look forward to hearing from Bahereh. So welcome, Bahereh. I hand over to you now. We look forward to everything you have to share with us this evening.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. Appreciate it. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah, I would just actually, Bahereh and I have been talking about this interview over the last week, and I've got a series of questions that I want to ask Bahereh about her family story of coming to Melbourne. It's quite a story, and I think there's actually a lot that we can learn from it today. So Bahereh, when did you actually come to Australia, and what kind of circumstances were you under when you came to Australia? What was happening in Iran, and why did you end up here?
Thank you, Yvonne. We were fortunate that we were able to come to Australia as a family in December 1980. My late husband and I, and two children, and my two daughters, we were able to travel together and establish our life here. Marjan was 9 and Ladan was almost 4 when we arrived. We had wanted to come to Australia since 1976 or so. However, Nasser, my husband, had a standing contract with his work for 10 years and was not permitted to leave until 1982, when he was to complete his contract. So I think now I'm sharing with you 2 photos that is taken just before he was dismissed from his job. If it's okay, this is taken in beginning 1980, just a few months after revolution. So there are my husband and my 2 children, my mother-in-law, and the other one is my husband and my 2 daughters. Despite his senior position in the police forensic laboratories, he was dismissed a few months after the revolution in early 1980 on account of being a Baha'i. And it was his being dismissed that made it possible for us to come to Australia. As you know, in 1979, the Islamic Revolution had started, and soon after that, the persecution of the Bahais intensified. During that time, there was a very open and persistent dismissal of Bahais from long-standing and reputable posts and positions. I'm sharing this on the day Nasser was supposed to receive a promotion. He was told that due to being a Baha'i, he was being dismissed. So this is kind of the translation of what's said. For Nasser, this sudden drop from a senior respected position to being asked to leave without any notice was a very big shock. The National Spiritual Assembly of Iran had asked a few Baha'is who were dismissed to appeal the dismissal, including Nasser. The response of his company clearly stated that Nasser had not imposed any his fate on anyone, and even mentioned that his dedication, his honesty. But it also outlined that due to being a Baha'i, he could no longer work. Nasser was utterly crushed, and his health was suffered as a result.
So this sounds like a very tough time for you, you and your family, Bahereh. Now, I understand this is about the time the Iran-Iraq war started. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. Not only we were dealing with revolution, political unrest, dismissal from work, children attending hostile school environment, while I was still holding down my work as a teacher at a high school. Now we were also amidst a war, taping our windows to prevent shattering in case of a bomb, staying indoors, hearing war sirens, lining up for food and other necessities, seeing military everywhere. And I was nursing a sick husband. So you can tell that as a result of his this problem, he lost his hair. You can see in this photo, and the other one, it's very obvious that it wasn't the best time for us. It was quite emotional and difficult. Many other dear Baha'i friends also at this same time being directly terrorized, imprisoned, and even martyred. Nasser's physician had said that unless he had the change of environment, he would not recover. We had managed to obtain visas to go to Australia. And that is a miraculous story that we don't have time for here. However, we could not find, we were not able to find outgoing flights. Because there was war. One day, out of nowhere, a friend who worked at the travel agency called to tell us about this medical evacuation flight that was departing for Turkey the next day. Practically, we had half a day to prepare for the next day to leave. And we had a night to decide what to take and what to leave. We didn't say goodbye to our neighbors, to our friends, relatives, family, no one. There was so much anxiety and fear in the departure process.
That's quite a moving story. I mean, imagine having to leave your country and culture so abruptly. You arrived in Australia. What were your first impressions of Australia? What was it like?
I think imagine that you had gone through this process of leaving Iran, and we were in India for a month and then arriving here. It wasn't the best situation, but we arrived in here. It was a small community back then. And we felt the Baha'i community was very welcoming and warm when we arrived. I felt we were entering an environment where we were one, united family. We just felt it. Everyone knew each other and helped when needed. We were received with love, respect, warmth. I didn't really feel a sense of culture divide in any way. It was really very beautiful time. This was our first experience being amongst non-Persian Bahais. I found beloved Australian Baha'i friends were very warm and very dedicated, vibrant, and unified believers. We moved to Kew, local spiritual assembly. Dear Jane and Sin Young Chu were our first friends, plus Katrina Lapp, Bill Fenner, and Gina Maxwell. So in this photo, that's the only photo I could find of this community. And with the little Emily, she was almost one. The local spiritual assembly of Kew was formed in 1981, just a few months after we arrived. Despite of our limited English, everyone always included us in their consultation process. And we tried very hard to integrate in the community through learning the language and the culture. So this is the photo of, we took in front of our apartment in Kew. In this photo also is my brother-in-law and our family. We were very happy that we arrived in the community, warm, beautiful community.
And you can see in these photos that Nasser is already looking a bit better than what he was in Iran, in this new environment. It must have still been, quite an adjustment, the abrupt departure, the landing in a completely different culture, even though you had a loving community. How did you feel at that time when you first arrived in Melbourne?
That's funny. That recently, dear Jane was sharing that at that time, and she was very surprised that despite being fortunate enough to have obtained a visa, escape the dangerous environment of Iran, and managed to finally get to Australia, that we weren't happy and elated as she expected. We probably looked miserable, tired, and experiencing myriad of emotions from leaving Iran and arriving in a new land. We were in a survival mode. So, yeah.
Yeah. So there were some Iranian Baha'i friends here at the time. So they had already settled. What was your experience with them at the time?
Yeah, we were trying really hard to assimilate into the life of community, and we were so busy trying to set up our lives, where to look for a place to live and where to shop the groceries, where we would establish our children in school, where to find things we needed, and so many other things. And it was at this time that some of the Iranian Baha'is who had been living in Melbourne helped a great deal and made a difference to our lives. It was at this time that we knew Haddad's and the Rashton's family from our days in Iran. Dear Zekri and Betty Haddad and their family were very helpful and welcoming. Farrokzadeh and Said in particular assisted and accompanied us in many ways. They provided that with the means we want. They would give practical advice about the facets of living in Melbourne. Farrokzadeh would sometimes drive back and forth from our place to their home, which was 45 minutes drive, to the store several times in one day, and also take care of us and host us in their place for dinner. That woman was such a dear, exemplary sign of love, generosity. And she did this sort of caring act frequently. They even took our family to the Baha'i International Conference in Canberra and visited, and they took us to visit isolated believers in Albury afterwards in their spare car. This trip was really lifted up our spirit and was a great opportunity for us to meet new friends.
That's lovely. And I think I too, when I became a Baha'i years later, I actually remember Said and Farrokzadeh as well, their loving hearts. And that support, just doesn't that make a difference?
One day, in fact, I asked her, how can I ever repay your kindness and generosity? She said, you can do the same thing for others. I think this example, her example and these words changed my perspective about everything. I wanted to help. I wanted to serve. I began accompanying refugees and other migrants. I would at times visit their homes and see how I can assist in their needs, whether it was in practical or personal level. I knew this service made a great difference to the lives of the new arrivals, and I felt it was my duty to help in this way.
So I understand, Bahereh, that you weren't in Kew for very long. You moved from Kew to Doncaster. So tell us a bit about why did you move and what happened?
Actually, it may sound very strange now to think that Doncaster, which is now part of Manningham, had one Baha'i family living there when we moved. Doncaster was transitioning from orchards and farmlands to a residential area on the outskirts of Melbourne. During this time, there was a teaching conference at the Baha'i Center, maybe with 60, 70 Baha'is. So we saw Doncaster was a goal area, but we were not familiar with this area until, while we were looking, a house became available in this area. So when we visited the neighborhood, we liked it, so we decided to move to this community. So there was one family, as I said, there was Batson's family, Gail and Noel, and their 2 children. They were so delightful, understanding, and warm. Again, we felt such a warm atmosphere to move to. Once we settled, I would jump at any chance to encourage friends to move to our community so we can form the local spiritual assembly. I encouraged the Kholusi family to just arrive from Tasmania, and they were so delighted they eventually agreed. Soon thereafter, Lou and Maisie Dodwell came from Adelaide, so the local spiritual assembly of Doncaster was formed in 1983. And when we found Eddie Cobb, who was living in that area, so the assembly was formed. So you can see this photo is 1983. And the next one I'm going to share is the community at the community feast. The next photo, if I can show you that, at Kholusi's home, a small community. By then, Elham and Niloofar also moved. Yeah. The next one is 1980. Oh, this is 85 actually. 85 and local spiritual assembly is 1985. The next one, 1991, we had 6 women in the local spiritual assembly. So I kind of find this photo could be interesting in here. And the next one is 1998, just before we moved to China. We pioneered to China.
So that was just an amazing, eventful period. Like in 5 years, you'd left Iran, helped form 2 new local spiritual assemblies, and you're still adjusting to life, I would imagine, in Australia, and that's still a big adjustment. It doesn't happen overnight. But what was a Baha'i life in Doncaster at this time?
I think for me, it was very important to become part of the wider community, rather than just live like a visitor and exist there without making a contribution. In those early days, I did everything I could despite my limited English. I became a the member of the school council for my children's school. Within a few months, I went to the local municipal offices and asked for volunteering opportunities, and which led to become a regular volunteer for Dawn Care, which I had the joy of helping single parents, single mothers who needed support with another group, Do Care, that I was involved for many years before I went to China. Actually, I stopped then. So I would spend an hour or two with seniors, lonely seniors of the community, talking to them and providing company. And I often would take my prayer book to these homes, and I ask their help in pronunciation of words as I learned the prayers. I'm sure this made them feel empowered and useful.
That's just a fabulous story, isn't that? And it also helped them become acquainted with the holy writings, but in a way, as you said, that they felt valued, and they've certainly got a lot to offer. So you said like you had a really busy life at this time. What was happening? What other things were happening in your life?
Actually, at that time, I was working part-time and I was studying part-time. I had been a teacher in Iran and headmistress of the school, but in Australia, I got my qualification as a teacher at TESOL, teaching English as a second language, as well as learning, of course. And I was teaching to migrants, and I ended up getting my master's for this, and this actually helped me, and I enjoyed it very much, and also helped my future service. At that time in the community also, we were very much engaged in the life of the community. I mean, at that time, we didn't know the term social action, but whatever we were doing, it was to do with social action. We helped with, this is the, photo of the community members with the mayor of the town, of the Doncaster offices. And we were helped with Red Cross collection and fundraising. We visited nursing homes. Few of us representing the Baha'i community in citizenship ceremonies, helped with education campaign about recycling in 1982, tree planting for International Year of Peace, and also for the Holy Year that the mayor of the town, of the city was involved, taking part in community activities. So we were quite busy within the community and very visible everywhere. We were everywhere, even though small, but we were everywhere. When there was an opportunity, we grabbed it and support each other to act. Mm. And also, I like to show you this, newspaper cutting that we had stories regularly published in our local paper, including, the services, the activities we had. And we look for any opportunity to utilize this local platform to communicate the activities of the Baha'i community in Doncaster. I really believe that immersing in the life of the community is central to forming a genuine friendship and relationship. And I think this immersion not only helped me to serve and teach the faith, it also assisted me to heal the pain of leaving my homeland and feel this is truly my home.
Mm. I think that's quite an example. I think that's quite an example for us today, isn't it? About being outward going. And, like you had every excuse, these early Persian believers had every excuse to feel, I'm too shy, I don't have enough English, but you just immerse yourself. What an example. But I also understand that you started teaching the Persian language. And can you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, I had to do something in my spare time. So, I just noted with, that with a few other Persian families, we noted that, there was a need to have some, for some families, that was important for them, for the children to speak the language. So along with some of the other Persian families, we began our classes with 8 children, and in 1982, within a year, we had about 21 students, and even we had classes for adults. We had, for non-Persian spouses. In 1991, I learned about the
I think something's happening with the sound.
I learned about this through the Victorian School of Languages, the Board of Studies, and they offered this for year 11 and 12, would offer the Victorian Certificate of Education. So I wrote a curriculum, and I was appointed as the chief assessor and the coordinator of the Persian language subject and the chairperson of the Persian language. So that was the kind of what we did at that time.
And that's such, I mean, what an amazing achievement. I mean, writing a whole curriculum and initiating that with the government and setting it up. I'm sure that the Persian language course is still going today. So you've got some photos here of you teaching, have you?
Actually, I just want to see if anyone knows these 2 girls. They are Baha'is. The one on the right, I'm sure everyone should know, is Salome Mohebati Imania, the member of National Spiritual Assembly on the right. And the one on the left is Sano Sano, the lovely girls. They were my students. And the other one, you can see me in a classroom, and then the end of the year celebration with this group. These courses that we put on, it would allow everyone, enable everyone with any senior students throughout Australia to be able to sit for the examination and get the certificate.
What a busy life. Look, at this time, I mean, there were just increasing numbers of Baha'is, I understand, arriving in Melbourne from Iran. Can you tell us a bit about, how they settled into Melbourne?
As you may know, or some friends know, from 1983, the Friends began to come in great numbers. By 1984, many more came as refugees. Nearly all the newer arrival had escaped through very dangerous situations via Pakistan and Turkey, and many had to stay there for several years while they waited to come to Australia. They had suffered a lot. I knew that how it felt like come in a new land with a limited or no language skills, with no idea how things work. I wanted to help these newcomers in the hope that the experience would be less difficult. So we began combining forces of a handful of Iranian Baha'i friends to visit newly arrival in a hostel, and eventually our group became more official and became the Persian Affairs Committee appointed by Regional Teaching Committee of Victoria, Mrs. Sabi MacDonald, Mr. Akbari and Kholusi, and a few others. We all decided systematically we provide loving support to the friends that were coming from Iran.
So, but there were some challenges, weren't there, at this time? I mean, like this kind of process of rapidly welcoming a large number of people from a different cultural background, that just generally doesn't go smoothly. So, the kind of challenges that the Victorian Baha'i community were facing.
Yeah, it was really very apparent that there were some, intercultural challenges. This appeared to dominate the gathering in terms of numbers and the way of communication. So the committee was later changed to Persian Australian Committee, and the task was to maintain the cherished unity of the community.
Yeah, and unity always has to be worked at, doesn't it? That doesn't just come without work.
Yeah. So many members of our community were experiencing the challenges of, pain and of transition, displacement, finding a sense of belonging. Everyone was right. The newly arrived Persian finally had found a safe haven to be free, to practice their faith and to be themselves. The existing community, after opening their hearts and homes for so long, suddenly felt they were now in the minority and did not understand the language being spoken in their own homeland amongst people of their own community during this community event.
So how did the Baha'is address this issue?
We decided to hold a couple of conferences to open up a dialogue to address this situation. Everyone was gathered together, and there was a stream in Persian and a stream in English. I attended the English stream to take notes for other friends. So the atmosphere was charged. There were, many who were grappling with this transition in the history of our community, and we could all feel the tension there. Actually, I never forget the words that the chairperson, dear Noor Batson, at the start of the gathering. This is, I'm going to share his photo if I could. So he unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. It was so dear. He said at the gathering, he said, I want you to consider for a moment that you suddenly need to leave your homeland and that you have to move to Germany. You arrive there, you find yourself unable to communicate, you can't read the street signs, you don't know how the rules are, what is happening there. You have left everything behind, and you have left your family, your relatives, anything you had. You feel lost and alone. You carry on your task and you do as best as you can. And then every 19 days, you attend a gathering where there are people who understand and speak your language. They speak English, and you can express yourself to them. If this was you, how would you feel? Would you not gravitate towards those people and speak your mother tongue? There was a silence for some time. I could feel the change in the energy of the room. The expression of faces softened. You could feel, you could sense it. He added, destiny brought these friends here. Many did not choose to be here. We need to be patient, be understanding. We need to support and love them. We have to find a way to communicate, even if we don't speak the same language. What can we do to help them to assimilate? And what can we do to help them to make life easier? This opening address by Noor shaped the discussion of the conference. It was so powerful. The example of attitude that we experienced by majority of dear Australian friends. Such understanding and wisdom.
That's very, very moving. And it's something too that I try and keep in mind what would happen if I suddenly landed in Iran, and I know I would really, really struggle with that. So these conferences help the community to become respectful and understanding and patient with others.
Actually, when I was going through my photos, I found this Victorian Baha'i conference. That the atmosphere of that day, I'm glad I found this photo. This is the entire Victorian Baha'i community. By this time, we had learned to collaborate, to work together and be outwardly. These early years were a period of change, and the friends had to adapt to the new circumstances with patience, love, and compassion. there was a great spirit of joy, unity, fellowship amongst this group. Really, it felt we were all one. And it was really at that time, whenever I see these photos, it takes me back to that time, that it was really honored to serve and be part of this vibrant community.
That's a really moving story, Bahereh. And coincidentally, this photo is taken in 1987 when I declared in Melbourne. And so I didn't know any of this backstory, but I came into a community, I came and met the friends before I was a Baha'i in 1986. And there were Baha'i youth, Persian Bahai youth they were wonderful friends to me. They were so welcoming and loving. And there were, people from other backgrounds that were so welcoming and loving. And now that I've got this backstory, I can see that it was very hard work, but my heart felt that work, that unity of spirit. And that was a very key reason why, I declared. So thank you very much, Bahereh, for sharing that very moving story. And I just wish we had time for more. I'd love to, have a chat about more of your story, but I know that we've got some other speakers who also have very interesting stories that we want to hear about tonight. So I'll hand it back to you, Graham.
Thank you, Yvonne. It was wonderful to have you today.
Yes, thank you, Yvonne, and thank you, Bahereh, for your story tonight. And I agree, we just wish we had so much more time to spend on these stories, but we see this as a start for future sharing of these experiences. So thank you so much. We move to our second presenter, Kourosh Farrokzadeh. Kourosh arrived in Australia as a fairly young man. He did his education in Sydney at the University of New South Wales, and he's going to share with us his experiences now. So Kourosh, can I hand over to you, please? I think we just need to unshare the screen. Bahereh?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize.
Thank you. Kourosh, you there?
We can hear Kourosh.
Is it okay now? Can you hear me now?
Better now.
Thank you, Kourosh. We're ready for you now. Kourosh, I'm sorry, but I'm not sure that we can hear you. And we're getting
I thought we did the
static
sound.
from the jack into the
Is
computer.
it okay now? Or is still? All right. How about now? I'm taking the jack, everything out. Is that good?
That's much better. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Sorry. Neighbors are having a bit of a party across the fence. So if you hear some interference, it's the neighbor's barbecue that is coming in. So thanks, Graham, for the wonderful series of talks, and it's an honor to be featured alongside all those heroes of the faith. To me, when I have been listening to these stories since a couple of months ago when Graham started the series, my first recollections was, these are the dawn breakers of antipodes. All these Collis Featherstones and Effie Bakers and all the rest of them. I remember a friends in Tasmania had to wait for 19 years to get the first Baha'i. So it's truly a big honor to be able to present in this series. And at the outset, I should explain that this is not a talk that is going to be about me. This is a really a snapshot of my recollections about the communities that I lived in Australia when I came here and settled here. And it's basically the story of a common thread of loving empowerment and consciously creating capacity throughout my life in Australia by the dear Australian Baha'i friends. And I try to make my recollections as complete as possible, but if by any chance I leave people out, please excuse. It's not intended, and it's only have half an hour, so it's quite natural that some people may be left out. Graham has given us a template to give an introduction. I was born in Iran, and then same as Bahereh, when events started happening in 79. My dad was dismissed from service, and he kind of felt alarmed about what was going to happen, and he kind of decided to make the move in stages. So I was 16 at the time, so he decided that I could kind of leave and open the door for the family, and they could come and join later. So I left for Pakistan and lived there for about 15 months, and in 84 I arrived in Australia, and I was met by one of the relatives. I lived in their house for about a month, and then I found a flat in Hornsby Baha'i community in a suburb also called Hornsby, because I was going to the high school just down the road, and basically settled there. So what I'm going to talk about is my encounters with the Hornsby Baha'i community. Actually, when I arrived, one of my first recollections of the temple is being taken to the temple and going down the Manabel Road. You could see the temple from the distance, and when we arrived in the temple, I can remember it very clearly. It was Blake with his white overalls and with his station wagon, the trailer behind it, loaded up with tools and garden debris, and he was walking away in the gardens, and that was it was very moving, arriving in the house of worship and seeing such dedication by the friends in the upkeep of the house of justice. And later on, I worked with him in installing the 2 speakers that are in the temple. And I remember Bob telling me, where are the friends? We need more people at the temple. They should come up to temple and work. And he was one of those silent heroes of the faith. Whenever he had time, he would drive all the way from Sutherland, where he lived, and come up to the house of worship. And it's quite a distance, at least an hour each way. Yeah, he's one of those people who really has a I'm sure if we were going to dedicate a session, we could easily fill it with stories about Blake and his services to the house of worship. So anyway, that was my first impression of arriving in the house of worship. And the Hornsby Baha'i community that I arrived at the time, there were it was a very closely knit community. Actually, I didn't get in touch with community for quite a while. I was 17 at the time, and I was going to high school, and I was living with a flatmate who was a British guy, and he was going through the paper, and he saw an ad about the fireside organized by the Baha'i community, and he told me, "Hey, look, there's a something about the Baha'is happening. Would you like to go and get in touch?" And I called, and next thing you know, there was John Gorrell, who was the chairman of the LSA, picked up the phone and gave me the address of the fireside, and that's how I basically got in touch with the community through an ad about the fireside in the paper. And the community at the time, there were David and Verna Podger, and of course their three daughters, Karen, Kath, and Dignity. There was Marie and Anthony Vojkovic, who was again another amazing couple, full of love and that spirit that really moves you to your. And there were the Scrines, David and Betty Scrine, and there were Furudis, Harry and Rui Furudi, and there were Michael and Win Honetsky. In particular, there was a couple of stories, that I would basically, every time you have a feast, there would be one of the community members come and pick me up, take me to the feast, or if I've gone to the feast by myself, I would invariably be dropped back by one of the community members. So it was something that had a great effect on me to be able to settle and feel as part of a community and not feel as being in a different country. In fact, I never had the feeling of being in a foreign country. I always felt at home, and I think it was the invisible support of the Baha'i community that was always there, and it was, I guess, an invisible supporting net that it was there, but you didn't feel that it was there. But it was actually their support that I believe sustains you through your life in the communities that you arrive in. There was also Michael and Win Honetsky, and they had just declared at the time in Hornsby, and it was a very closely knit and very loving Baha'i community. The feasts, basically social activities. It was going to the feast was always, and activities, community activities. We had working bees, community working bees at the temple. So one of the very few events that sticks in my mind is, going to the first visit to Yerembul. I was taken by one of the community members to Yerembul, and met Frank Khan there, also, who was, I found him have a great sense of humor, yet at the same time being very calm and gentle and very approachable, and a very humble person. My first impression of a youth conference was the Tukli Youth Conference that took place at the end of 1984. I remember I just had finished my first year of high school and went to the Tukli Youth Conference. The theme of the conference was Light Up Australia, and the Hand of the Coast, Collis Featherstone, was attending that conference. And a particular incident I remember was one of the speakers was talking about the guardian maybe not having left a will behind, and when Mr. Featherstone heard that, he became quite animated, and he got up from his chair and walked to the front of the conference and faced the audience, and he you could see the hand of the cause in action, and the speaker was was there as well, and he said that, friends, Shoghi Effendi told us that Abdul Baha has tied my hands, with his will and testament, he was trying to educate the friends. He was very concerned. You could see through his animated gesture, that he was very concerned that we get the facts right about, every aspect of the covenant of the faith. So that was one of my first impressions of Mr. Featherstone. In fact, it was my first encounter with Mr. Featherstone. I did take a photo, but I haven't put a photo portfolio together for this presentation, and because I've been away for some time overseas and just come back, and everything's in boxes. So my photos are not very accessible. So after finishing my high school, I went to run the community, to live in another great community full of loving Baha'is and three families. I can very easily say, Hassels, Grants, and Zains, were the pillars of the community when I arrived there. It was again, the same feeling that, I had in Hornsby repeated itself. Just the love and attention that you get from the Baha'i community was amazing. Proximity to UNSW meant that, the community had a constant flux of students coming in and out of the community. We had, at the year I went in, I think Abidi Ganegi was one of the new students. Katayun Hassel was one of the new students. Danny Sarushi, and there was a couple of pre-existing students there, like Ali Norouzi, Milan Vojkovic, Colin Dibden, and I think, my recollection, and I think, Jane Harper also joined the same year that I joined university. So, and there was a couple of others that joined later on, 1 or 2 years later. There were the Sanais and the Dalmanican brothers, and we also have Michael and Ranjana Putati became Baha'is in the university while I was there. So, we had a great Baha'i society there. We even had a soccer team. We handed out the peace message. It was the 1986, as you know, was the International Year of Peace, and I remember the Baha'i community in Sydney, in Australia, celebrating the International Year of Peace, and in Sydney we had the Peace Expo, but we had for the temple, we had these peace banners going all the way from the temple to Monavale. So we also had a plan of presenting peace messages to all the to many academics in School of Arts in UNSW. So it was a fairly active Baha'i society on campus. We had, I think, on that year, the Australian community also won the United Nations Peace Messenger Award. Then I remember there was, recollecting some particular individuals from the community. I have a, I mentioned, the Hassels who were in Randick. There were Judy and David Hassel were extremely supportive and very loving. Particularly, Judy was very quietly, trying to consciously create capacity in everybody, especially in the youth, that she saw around her. So in different by different means, she would try and try and seek out the youth in our community. I remember we had David, was doing a lot of work with apart from his responsibilities at ADM, he was also doing a lot of work with the Bahai Business and Professional Association. And I remember there was a presentation night that Stella Cornelius, who was the president of UN, was United Nations Australia, was also attending. And, I got a lift with David and Judy to attend that talk, and we were in the car with Stella, and Judy was trying to somehow, seek out and create conversations and create understandings, and basically create that capacity to be able to basically approach people of influence, and also I, as a university student, also as a fairly new arrival in Australia, be able to get the capacity to be able to meet those circumstances. Yeah, there is the grants where they're also in the community. I remember going to dinner at their place once, and Fred and Eva and Johnny, we had a great time. I remember I went there with Danny Sarushi, another one of the students who was in the same year as I was. It was a community that had that was full of love for all the students that were in the university, and I was not an exception. There is a couple of other conferences, youth conferences that I recall. There was the 1990 Toowoomba Youth Conference. I remember there was Kathy Freeman was in that conference. She was not as prominent then as she became later. She was then a junior, a New South Wales, I think, just won the New South Wales Championships, and she was trying to try out for the national team, and we had her as a keynote speaker in the youth conference. So got to meet her there as well, and it was we had a conversation with her, and it's quite surreal, that a couple of years later she became a celebrity, and but her mom, as we all know, was a Baha'i, and she was quite instrumental in her initially being fairly close to the faith, and attending that conference and giving that keynote speech. I remember also there was a conference in '93. We attended in Canberra, youth conference. Mash Featherstone was giving some of their accounts of meetings with the Guardian, and at the end of it, he suggested he offered the maps that were given by the Guardian to Mr. Featherstone. To whoever is interested in those maps, they can come and just take it. And I thought that was extremely generous of her to come to a youth conference and offer these maps that was drawn by the Guardian and given to Mr. Featherstone, and offer it to whoever wanted to take them. So it was an extremely gracious and generous gesture on part of Mrs. Featherstone. Then we also had the my other impressions of living in Sydney was different multicultural events that the friends would get involved in. They were quite amazing, and that had a great bearing on me in terms of being able to uh, get the, get an idea of the significance of trying to approach also the multicultural elements of the society as well. And I remember friends would organize teaching trips to Taiwan and come back with their slideshows. You know, Uganidis used to have these evenings at their houses, you know, in Farnell Street in West Ryde, and we used to go and attend those deepenings, and we had all these travel teachers who'd been to various places, Taiwan, you know, different places in Asia, would come and present their stories, and they were inspiring, you know, and they would inspire you to, you know, look at the faith in with the eye of diversity and try and embrace that diversity and try and multiply that diversity and make our faith to be more and more diverse, have as they say, everybody be able to show to share in the banquet table of the Lord, as they say, you know, in terms of all different nationalities. And you know, it was during those times, and also there was these teaching campaigns that were happening in the Cabramatta community in Sydney. There was a big hotbed of Chinese teaching there, and all of these helped to kind of plus also a lot of travel teachers would come back and would put on slideshows about what they've seen and all that. So it was there was a lot of interest generated in uh, in travel teaching as well as pioneering. So I did eventually do a professional exchange for a couple of years to mainland China, and yeah, it was quite a rewarding and valuable experience. Uh, that's all I had to share about my experiences today. Maybe there's a few photos that Graham has sent me. Maybe I can later on find those photos and share them with you as well. But thank you, dear friends. It's an honor to be part of this series. And yeah, I hand it back over to Graham.
Thank you, Kourosh, for giving us that overview of your arrival in Sydney. I think you've left out quite a few interesting aspects of your early life as a student, but you'll leave that for another time. Look, well, let's move to our third speaker. So Niloofar Shaibani is part of our local community in Gold Coast, where we are. That's how I met her and invited her into this presentation. So Niloofar, if you're there, we'd like to invite you to share your story with us.
Sure. Aloha, dear friends. It is truly a great privilege and honor to be in your company. Thank you, dear Graham, for inviting me to share my story, which is really one of many thousands of stories, as we heard from dear Bahereh and dear Kourosh. So I'm honored to be here. My name is Niloofar Shaibani. I was born in Tehran. I thought I'd start from the beginning, from the background to my story before arrival in Australia, because that plays an important role in the overall story. So I was born in Tehran. I had a relatively happy and carefree childhood before the revolution. My parents were both employees at the Tehran University before the revolution. And I have one older brother. So I was 10 years old at the time of revolution in 1979. And I remember our lives changing very quickly and drastically in a matter of few months. Although as Baha'is, we were always harassed in Iran, but these harassments intensified after the revolution, and it quickly became persecutions. So shortly after the Islamic government took power in Iran, many Baha'is were fired from their jobs in the government positions through a systematic Baha'i cleansing program. So my mother was one of them. My mother lost her job at Tehran University after 19 years of service. And my father's retirement pension was also stopped. Shortly after that, as dear Bahereh mentioned, the war between Iran and Iraq broke out. And during those months, obviously, there was a lot of change, a lot of pain that we had to go through. And then my brother, who had finished his high school at that time, left Iran with a passport that he had from the time before the revolution. So these were some family things that were happening in our lives. And after the Baha'is were dismissed from their jobs, the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Iran advised the Baha'is to write to the authorities and protest against their dismissal and reclaim their rights as citizens of Iran to hold government jobs. So my father was one of those friends who wrote to the authorities and protested against his dismissal. As a result of that, he was summoned to the notorious Evin prison in Tehran, and he was imprisoned for a short while. At that time, I remember I was very young, and my mother was recovering from a major operation when our house was raided late at night by the Islamic guards, and the whole house was searched for many, many hours, and we were interrogated by the intruders, and they were trying to cause and create terror in our hearts. And it was a particularly testing and difficult time. Then after that, shortly after that, my father was released from the prison, but he was, the harassment and the court summits continued for many years after that. So I grew up in an environment where we were deprived of many freedoms like other Baha'is, fellow believers. In that environment, I finished my high school, and obviously there was a lot of harassment happening daily at the high school, but we got used to it. That was part of life, and we accepted it. So I finished my high school, but with no prospect of any further education at the tertiary level. I remained in Iran after that for 3 years, where I was immersed in the Baha'i education along with the other youth in our community. And this was through the sacrificial and truly devoted service of our Baha'i teachers and Baha'i scholars. This allowed us to be deepened in many Baha'i writings. We went through a series of holy texts and writings. And at the same time, it created bonds of fellowship and love among the youth and the community. So at this time, in the last year of my residence in Iran, I was admitted to the underground Baha'i University, which was, as the name suggests, it was very risky underground, and it was very dangerous to all the participants at all levels if we were found out. But it also had a very high standard of education. At that time, my parents were kind of encouraging me to leave Iran because they were worried that should something happen to them, I would be better off living with my brother in Canada, who was residing there. So for a while, I kind of resisted their wishes because I didn't want to leave my parents behind. But finally, in 1990, I accepted and I decided to leave Iran. Obviously, at that time, we were not entitled to have passports. So there were two routes out of Iran, one through Turkey and the other through Pakistan. my parents chose the route to Turkey, and they started arranging for that trip through some contacts. And this was a risky business in itself to find the contacts and organize the trip. And usually the cutoff date for the travel out of Iran through Turkey, the mountainous area of between Iran and Turkey, would be around September, because after that it would become a very difficult passage through, because of the snow and ice. And we're planning to leave. We were the final group to leave Iran in the month of September 1990. But due to some clashes that were happening on the border between the Kurds and the Iranian guards, our trip was delayed. And so we ended up leaving in late October, early November in 1990. Now, I was in a group of, actually, I had to say my goodbye to my mother in Tehran. That was the last time I saw my mother in Iran. And then my father accompanied me to the city of Tabriz on the border, close to the border. And there I met, other youth and another family. I was also in the company of two other youth whom I knew from Iran, from our community in Tehran. And so there was a group of 10 Bahais, myself being one of them, living at night through the mountains. So I said again my goodbye to my beloved father, who was at an advanced age at that time in Tabriz. And goodbyes are always difficult under the best of circumstances. But when you are leaving your elderly parents behind, not knowing if you would ever see them again, it was particularly painful. So we were, we had to pass, the group of 10 had to pass a couple of checkpoints disguised in Kurdish attires to reach the mountains, and from there to start our journey. I remember it was particularly cold. Obviously, it was, at a time that the temperatures were cold, and we were truly worried about our trip over the mountains. But, and so after passing those checkpoints, we started ascending the mountains on horseback for many hours, and then coming down the mountains on foot, and finally crossing the border over a river that was there and onto the Turkish soil. I had the unfortunate accident of falling off the horse when we were crossing the border, and I broke my skull, but that was part of the journey. So we crossed onto the Turkish soil, and that part of the Iranian soil was behind us, and so that was the first part of the journey. And then when we were on the Turkish soil, again, we had to move through stages from shelters and villages to get closer to the destination. And the final leg of the journey was from one of those villages. We got on the bus, the coaches, to go to the capital of Turkey, Ankara, where the United Nations office was, so we can become officially refugees on the Turkish soil and to be given protection. And that final leg of the journey would take around something between 15 to 17 hours on the bus. So we were very happy that we have, put the main part of the journey behind us, although we were still illegals on the Turkish soil. Where again, unfortunately for our group, we were captured by the Turkish police when we were only a couple of hours from Ankara. So 9 out of 10 Baha'is that we were in that group were captured and arrested and imprisoned by the Turkish police. And one managed to continue his way on that journey. And, we tried to explain to the police, the Turkish police, that what our situation is. We were Baha'is, we were being persecuted in Iran, but the decision was made that we were illegal and we had to be deported back to Iran. So it was a very traumatic time for all of us. We were imprisoned for a while, and for a short time, actually for 2 weeks, our families in Iran were unaware of our whereabouts, what had happened to us, what had become of us. And after a while, we were moved from prison to prison to be taken back to one of the cities on the border between Iran and Turkey, which is called Van, and from there to be deported back to Iran. So for a month, that was our story, going back from prison to prison. And I remember when we arrived in the city of Van, we were under house arrest in a small motel. And by that time, our family and friends were aware what was happening to us, and they were trying desperately, to find a way to protect us. On the final night, when the Turkish police said that, tomorrow morning you will be handed back to the guards on the Iranian soil, I remember all of us were sitting down and we said the tablet of Ahmad. Because the situation was really desperate. If we would be deported back to Iran, obviously the outcome would have been very bad for us. I remember as we finished saying the tablet of Ahmad and we were sitting in silence in that motel, a telephone call came to our room. I picked up the phone and I heard this man talking on the other side of the line with a German accent. He was speaking in English and he introduced himself as one of the lawyers from the United Nations office in Ankara. And he said that we knew that, a group of Baha'is were captured. We were looking for you everywhere all this time, but because you were being moved from prison to prison, we could not locate you. But now we have found you, so don't worry. You're under our protection and the Turkish police is going to give passage to you to Ankara tomorrow morning. So that was in itself a miracle in our lives. We were given passage. We were taken to the United Nations office the next day and we were given protection. And I stayed in Turkey for a year awaiting my visa to go to Canada. And we were under the supervision of the National Spiritual Assembly of Turkey, United Nations, as well as the Turkish police for our protection. I met my future husband, Mehran, in Turkey, who was on his way to Australia, Perth, although we didn't get married at that time. So after a year in 1991, my visa arrived and I moved to Toronto to live with my brother. And I lived in Canada for more than a year. When finally in 1992, Mehran and I decided to get married. He was living, as I said, in Perth, Australia. And so I moved to Perth in 1992 and we started our family life there together. Now, I remember the first few years, obviously, as Bahereh said, that you are in a survival mode. You are trying to find your way around the country, new community, learning the language and focusing on our studies in the university. But, also at the same time enjoying the freedom and advantages of being able to having a prospect actually in life and being able to practice your faith freely. I remember at that time I was part of the Sterling, we were part of the Sterling community in Perth, which was one of the largest communities. And most of the community was comprised of friends who were like us, refugees or immigrants from Iran to Australia. I remember the first time I decided to go to the feast. I was obviously young, very shy, and my husband Mehran had a final exam that night. And this is a story I never forget because this was my first encounter with the Baha'i community in Perth. So I made my way by myself to Scarborough Community Center where we used to have the Baha'i feasts. And as I arrived there, I was very hesitant and shy and second guessing myself for coming alone to the feast. And I was standing in the shadows by the entry to the hall. And as friends were passing me by and entering the community center for the feast to begin, I thought maybe this wasn't a good idea. Maybe I go back and I come back the next feast with my husband. Then an elderly Persian couple just on their way to the hall stopped next to me, sensing that I was new to the community. These were Persian Bahais. And they greeted me and introduced themselves. They were Mr. and Mrs. Fahimian, the senior Fahimians. And they asked me if I'm new to the community. And I said, yes, I am. And they asked my name, and I introduced myself by my maiden name, Niloofar Khazrai. And they said, Khazrai, are you from the province of Khorasan? Is your father from the province of Khorasan in Iran? And I said, yes. And suddenly Mr. Fahimian started crying. And he said, you know, my ancestor was introduced to the faith, became a Baha'i, came to know about the Baha'i faith through your ancestor, who was one of the 7 martyrs in Yazd at the time of Baha'u'llah. So that's how he learned about the Baha'i faith, and I always remember him in my prayers. So my ancestor was introduced to the faith through that events, the events leading to the martyrdom of your great-grandfather. Now let me introduce you to the Baha'i community in Stirling. So for the entire feast, this dear Persian friend had his beloved wife on one of his arms and me on the other arm, and introduced me to everyone. And I felt so welcome in that community. And that was my first encounter. After that, gradually I became involved in the children classes, Baha'i children classes, where we used to have at a local state school on Sundays. And that was truly beautiful and a wonderful experience for me, because we were not used to having, you know, such free environment to teach the children. And it was always dangerous in Iran to have those children classes or any deepenings. But this was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot through that. At the same time, I was studying at the Murdoch University, and we started having weekly devotionals and forming a Baha'i society at Murdoch University with some of my fellow students, Baha'i students. And that was a great experience in itself. So, and my husband was studying at the same time. Then we moved to the Bayswater community in Perth, where I served on the assembly for a number of years, and I was the secretary for 2 of those years. And again, that was a great experience, learning, obviously, and becoming familiar with the administrative side, you know, of our institutions. Finally, and we had our first child, Arya, in Perth. And then my parents actually were granted, my father was granted a passport for one travel because the United Nations pressured the Islamic government in Iran. And so they started issuing passports to some of the older members of the community, and my father was one of them. And my mother, although refused to be given a passport, was added as a companion in my father's passport, and they arrived in Australia. And it was such a joyous, beautiful occasion, because I never thought that I would see my parents again, because they were at an advanced age. And they were granted a protection visa because of the documents they had from the imprisonment time of my father in Iran and his persecution. At the same time, at that time, my brother was serving at the World Center, so there was no prospect of them for going to Canada. So it was a blessing that the Australian government accepted to grant them onshore protection visa, and we started, you know, to have some family life together. In 2002, my family and my parents, we moved to the Gold Coast. We decided that for employment reasons, and also We liked the environment, so we moved there. We moved to the Gold Coast community. At that time, the size of the Gold Coast community was around 100, which is relatively smaller, significantly smaller to what we have right now, which is more than 500. And our second child was born here. And again, I became quickly involved with the children classes, the Baha'i children classes at the Baha'i Center on the Gold Coast, because my son was at that around the age that he would start the children classes. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience collaborating with other teachers and serving on the children's committee and learning and engaging with the children. Also at the same time, because we didn't have a play group as such at that time for my second child, I decided to become involved with one of the church play groups, which again was a wonderful occasion to become engaged with the wider community. And I remember those times fondly because these wonderful Christian friends who welcomed me to their playgroup at the church. They would allow me to share prayers every time we had a playgroup from the Baha'i faith, and they would share their Christian prayers. And it was truly a very wonderful occasion to share some of the writings and prayers from the faith. After the decentralization of the children classes and also the division of the community into sectors, we focused on the neighborhood classes. I also became involved in the best classes and, in some of the local schools, which was a great experience. And through some of these best classes, as well as my son's school, I was invited to speak at the Refugee Week about my experience, my belief, my circumstances in Iran, how I came to leave Iran, and my life here in the Baha'i community in Australia. And that was also a wonderful opportunity for me to share some of the experiences we had as a community in Iran, and why I left Iran and I came to Australia. All this time, obviously, I had the bounty and the blessing of being in a Baha'i community that, helped feel welcome, in Australia, and to learn from many, many beautiful souls in the community. In 2006, I had the honor of being appointed to serve in the institution of Huququllah, and so I focused on that side of the service and activity. Truly, I had the bounty of learning from many beautiful souls and believers in that institution, and being able to focus all my energy perhaps in that area. Obviously, there are times in your journey that I remember a particular time going back to my years in Perth, that I was feeling at some point a little bit, before my parents arrived, a bit guilty, and thinking, I'm here, my fellow believers are in Iran, and I was feeling homesick. Although I had a lot of support from the Baha'i community. I remember at that time, one of the friends gave me a book, Olia's story, from our beloved Olia Ruhizadegan. And when I read that story, it helped me a lot, thinking that there is, we all have journeys. We all have, there's no coincidence that each of us has ended up in the place that we are. It is providence. Because, the coming together of East and West, a new race is emerging, a new culture is emerging. And, that helped me to overcome my, particular difficulties that I had at that time. And to continue on a path that perhaps part of it was not my choice, but part of it I could still make some decisions about. I think that, many of these stories, there is obviously all of us who have left after the years of revolution. We have had traumatic journeys, traumatic experiences, challenges to face in finding yourself in a new environment, learning about a new culture, adapting to a new life, but at the same time, privileges to further develop our lives, personal lives, and to learn more. And also because coming from a background that is different, doors have been opened to us to share our story, to share the story of those fellow believers who are still in Iran and they're going through hardship. And it's that force that prompts you to continue your journey for yourself, for your family, but also for your fellow believers in Iran, and continuing. Now, I was going to share this on screen with you, but unfortunately I have some problems with my laptop. So I'm just going to read this passage from the beloved late Dr. Arbab from one of his talks. And this is apparently the closing remarks, which affected many. And when I read this, it truly resonated with me. And I thought that it would be lovely to share it with you, with your permission. So Dr. Arbab is saying, somewhere inside yourselves, somewhere in your very essence, you have to believe, you have to be confident that you are not in charge of your life. The only real decision I truly believe that you will ever really need to make is, am I going to turn my life over to Baha'u'llah? My life has consisted of walking through open doors. Really, if you want to know the story of my life, that's essentially it. I have prayed and asked God to guide me to the right path. And then I walked through open doors. A few doors were closed very definitely in my face, and a few I knocked on for a bit longer before walking away. Some things you do plan for, your studies, your career, but for the most part, it's finding these doors and acquiescing to his will. And I think truly for most of us, whether in Iran or outside Iran, there are personal circumstances in our lives that we don't have any choice or any say about it. But there is one aspect, and that is the life of service. And I truly believe that many Persians who have left Iran, and as well as all the believers around the world, they can connect and relate to this passage. And finally, I want to share one very personal experience that I had when living in Iran on top of the mountains in the middle of the night. I remember when ascending those mountains, reaching the top of the mountain, for a moment I was reflecting on my journey and my life and thinking, I have nothing with me at this point. I have left my parents behind. I'm not sure where my journey is going to end, but the only thing that I know for sure I have is the love that I have for Baha'u'llah and for my faith. And I pray to Baha'u'llah at that moment, please, I have lost everything. Don't take your love away from me. That is the only treasure that I have in my life. And I'm truly honored to be able to share my story with you, which is, as I said, one of many thousands. I'm truly honored to be in your company. And this is where I ended for Graham to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Niloofar. That's truly moving presentation. You've been very generous in the manner you've shared with us your story. We've had 3 stories this evening that begin as stories of loss, but are ultimately stories of courage, of resilience, of bravery, of service, of humility, of victory. And these are some of the qualities that came to mind as I heard the 3 speakers this evening. So thank you so much for that, and thank you to Bahereh, thank you to Kourosh. We have a time for questions. And so before we do that, Bahereh has just one additional item to share with us, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So Bahereh, do you have that item ready for us?
The reason I'm sharing this, Graham, is because a great number of articles that it was printed in the local paper when I was involved in them. I was a publicity officer, and we had great number of stories and articles that with the hope that it would help the community to kind of make sure we have close contact, regular and close contact with the media, with the newspaper, because we have a beautiful faith. And Niloofar shared such a beautiful story, really touched my heart. She talked from my heart. So we have lots of good stories to share with the public. So the reason I wanted to show this, because this shows that when our connection with the media and the local community outside the faith is very important for them to get to know what the life we had and what we went through and where we are and why we are here. The love of Baha'u'llah would make us to give us this drive that to do this, to share with the community. So I wanted to share this with the community. Hopefully this work now, because it didn't work first time we tried just to show the article. So hopefully that's true. You did, no? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Bahereh. We did see it this time. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to share end the recording at this stage, and then we'll be free to ask a question. So thank you, friends, for everything presented tonight.